Imagine leaving home to serve your country, only to return and discover that the very people who smiled in your face had sold your land out from under you, without permission, without shame, and without expecting the storm you were about to unleash. If you want more jaw-dropping true story-style narratives where justice comes back swinging harder than anyone thought possible, make sure to subscribe right now and stick around, because this story isn't just about betrayal, it's about revenge, law, and the kind of power that only discipline and strategy can deliver. When I signed my deployment papers and left for a long overseas tour, I had no reason to believe that anything back home could turn into a battlefield more complicated than the desert sands I was being sent to. Yet life has a way of setting up wars where you least expect them, and mine began when I came back to find out that the land I had bought years ago with my hard-earned money, the land I planned to build a quiet retirement cabin on, was no longer mine, at least not according to the local homeowners association, a group of power-hungry neighbors who saw my absence as an opportunity to manipulate paperwork, bend zoning rules, and sell off vacant land to developers who were eager to carve out cookie-cutter houses for quick profit. But the catch was, the land wasn't truly vacant, it was my legally recorded property, fenced off and marked, and though I hadn't built on it yet, it was no more theirs to sell than my uniform or my medals. So the moment I read the letter from a friend telling me the HOA had bulldozed half my lot and paved a street through what used to be my favorite fishing spot, something in me snapped. Not in the reckless, out-of-control way, but in the cold, calculated way of a soldier who has been trained to assess, strategize, and execute, because while they thought they could get away with hiding behind their local connections and small-town corruption, they had forgotten that I had access to something far bigger than their gated subdivision, the United States military and the resources that come when you prove your land was stolen while serving your country. At first, I tried the polite route, I really did. I went to an HOA meeting dressed in plain clothes, sat at the back of the room, and waited until they introduced themselves with smug smiles and offered coffee as though nothing was wrong. Then I raised my hand and calmly asked why there were now 15 houses standing where my deed said my parcel stretched, and the silence that followed was almost amusing, as though no one had rehearsed an answer for the day I might actually return. One of them, a man with a fake tan and an expensive watch who introduced himself as the HOA president, cleared his throat and told me there must be some mistake, that according to their records the lot had been marked unclaimed for years, and since no taxes had been paid, it was auctioned off legally to the developer. But that was their first mistake, because I had receipts, years of tax payments made online, all time-stamped and signed off by the county, proving I hadn't missed a single payment even while I was thousands of miles away dodging mortars. When I produced those receipts, their smiles cracked, but they still tried to stall, saying the matter had to go through the proper channels, and that undoing development would be nearly impossible. Little did they know, impossible was my specialty. I went home, pulled out every scrap of evidence I had, contacted a JAG lawyer I knew from deployment, and within a week had initiated a federal inquiry, not just into the HOA but into the county office that had allowed the fraudulent sale to go through, and once the military stepped in, citing protections for deployed service members under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, things began unraveling faster than they could pour their morning coffee. It turned out the HOA president had connections with the developer, his brother-in-law to be exact, and the auction had been nothing more than a paper shuffle signed by a county clerk who owed favors. In other words, they thought no one would ever notice, that the quiet soldier overseas would never return to make noise, but I came back louder than a tank rolling through their picket fences. The lawsuit alone would have been enough to bankrupt them, but the real twist came when the federal government froze construction, declared the land improperly seized, and essentially repossessed the entire subdivision under my ownership until the matter could be resolved. Imagine the looks on those homeowners' faces when they received letters stating that their brand new dream houses now stood illegally on land tied up in federal litigation, and that they might have to vacate unless they wanted to start paying rent directly to me. At first, many of them turned on me, calling me selfish, saying I was destroying families, but as I shared my story publicly, about how my service had been disrespected, my rights trampled on, and my land stolen, the tide shifted, and soon the local news picked it up, framing me as the veteran who took on corruption and fought back. And once that narrative caught fire, even the homeowners began to realize they'd been conned by the HOA as much as I had. Meanwhile, the HOA board members started resigning one by one, hiding from cameras, while the president tried to cut a deal, offering me money under the table to just walk away, but by then it was far too late. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about principle, about reminding people that those who serve don't come home to be cheated by bureaucrats in polos and khakis. The military didn't stop at freezing the subdivision. They sent engineers to survey the land, fencing it off as disputed property under federal protection, which meant armed guards patrolled the streets where children had been riding bikes just a week earlier. A surreal sight that left the community stunned but also oddly respectful, because nothing says, "You messed with the wrong person," like Humvees parked at the end of cul-de-sacs. The investigation dug deeper, uncovering years of shady dealings by the HOA, double charging fees, misreporting maintenance costs, and even forging signatures on zoning requests, and the fallout was massive, with several officials facing indictments, the developer filing for bankruptcy, and the HOA disbanded permanently. As for me, I stood at the edge of my land one evening, looking over the half-finished houses, the torn-up roads, the silence that had replaced the arrogance of board meetings, and I felt a strange calm, as though justice had been served not by rage but by precision, by letting the truth march in formation until it crushed everything false. But the story didn't end there, because the county, desperate to avoid further lawsuits, offered me a deal: keep the land and the houses, sell them off as I wished, or demand full demolition and restoration to its original state. Most people would have cashed out, taken millions and walked away, but I chose a middle path, transforming the subdivision into housing for veterans, a safe place for those who had served and returned with nowhere to go, turning the very betrayal meant to profit the greedy into a sanctuary for the selfless. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The HOA tried to erase me while I was deployed, but in the end, my land became a monument to those who could never be erased. And when the ribbon-cutting day came, with rows of American flags flying where once there had been lies and fraud, I smiled knowing that the battle had been worth every ounce of energy, every document filed, every meeting where they rolled their eyes, because in the end, they didn't just lose their subdivision, they lost their power, their reputations, and their illusion of control. My only regret, if any, was that I couldn't see the look on their faces the exact moment the military repossessed their pride and joy, but maybe that's better left to the imagination, because sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones whispered about in the quiet shame of those who thought they'd never be caught.